I won't make any introductory remarks. I think I'd like to really just dive in very quickly to the many issues that we can engage today. I want to make an explicit linkage to the focus on affordable housing that's been so much discussed about the administration and also already a part of this panel, and to transportation. Can I call you Paulie?
Yes, please.
Would you like to talk a little? We've heard a lot about your Vision Zero, but of course, what do you feel is the connection between transportation and housing in terms of affordability?
I mean, the connection is fundamental, and it's great to see Zav here, as you were saying, my former colleague in the Obama administration. One of the things we managed to do in the Obama administration, it only took us, federal government, 60 years to do this, is to create a partnership between Department of Transportation, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and EPA, to essentially try and work together in a coordinated fashion on housing, transportation, economic development, and water, and all the environmental things that go with it. And it proved to be a really groundbreaking partnership, and one that in retrospect, you sort of said, why haven't we been doing that for 50 years? It's fundamental, and you know, as you know, the history in New York and all over the United States is we often did housing, particularly low-income housing, completely disconnected from transportation planning, and we got suitably bad results. So it is absolutely fundamental, and you know, I can tell you from the point of view of the de Blasio administration, DOT is going to be working very, very closely with Carl and all the housing agencies and Kyle at EDC to try and really tackle this in a holistic way. You can't have one without the other.
I want to mention a couple of opportunities here that you really want to focus on.
Well, again, I mean, I think from DOT's point of view, and you know, Margaret was mentioning it a little bit in her work, you know, we have the real bread and butter transportation element of what we do, which is our roads and bridges having a good transportation network, and then some of our more ambitious efforts like select bus service, where we're trying to find some more low-cost ways to build upon the city's existing transit network and particularly connect to areas that need better transit service. And some of you may have seen, we just announced actually our 7th select bus service line yesterday up in Harlem, connecting Harlem with Astoria, Queens, and LaGuardia Airport, which is a huge, huge job generator. LaGuardia has 82,000 employees. So, and then I think one of the other things I'm sure this panel is going to get into is how we also enhance public space writ large all over the city, both public plazas, art, you name it. And I think that is also a part of, you know, a vision of a city where, and I think some folks have mentioned in previous panels, we really enhance every neighborhood around the city in terms of its transportation connections and the public space.
I want to move to Laura because you actually have an explicit connection with DOT, right? So you might talk about what's really working there, what can really grow.
Hi, good morning. So I run a program called Neighborhood Plaza Partnership, which is about a year old and was created in consultation with the DOT Plaza program around the pedestrian plazas that are being built all over the city. And our mission is really to ensure that those plazas flourish in every kind of neighborhood, because every New Yorker deserves to have the same level of public realm amenity that we see all across Manhattan. So there are sort of 2 points that I wanted to make about that. And one is that we are in this paradigm shift of the way New York City views and uses its streets. And for plazas, that really started about 6 years ago when the city closed down large swaths of Broadway and created the Times Square plazas. And I know everybody here remembers the lawn chairs, right? And what happened is people sat in them in droves immediately. And that kind of attraction to being in the street happens all over the city, but it looks pretty different because the large-scale commercial events and even yoga for thousands that you see in Times Square or in other parts of Midtown Manhattan gives way to sort of raucous hula hooping in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. The plaza manager there said this is the best $1.18 ever spent on programming just to give a bunch of kids some hula hoops. And you see the transformative power of that. You know, in East New York, the annual Easter parade starts at Zion Plaza. In Jackson Heights, Diversity Plaza, which is so named to represent the many nationalities that live in that neighborhood, hosts the annual Muslim Eid festival. It also hosts the annual Gay Pride Parade. It hosts Bangladeshi New Year, and most recently the Dalai Lama's birthday. It's an amazing array of programming. And 2 years ago, both new immigrants and residents alike crowded in that tiny little space to watch a live screening of the presidential debates. So it's that kind of really local programming that makes these plazas amazing and makes them really important to neighborhood vitality and all the things that we've been talking about earlier today. When we did a Jane's Walk for MAS a few weeks ago, and we were at Corona Plaza, and while the council member, Julissa Ferreras, was talking about the intricacies of capital construction, there was a game of hide and seek happening with Spanish kids counting down wildly and hiding among the planters. And then we had an Ecuadorian artist talk about the role that these places play for families who don't have living rooms, much less backyards. So there are a lot of reasons for us as a city to care about the health and vitality of these spaces because of what they can mean for neighborhoods. There's a flip side to all of that, but we can come back to that in a few minutes.
Let me just follow up a little bit. Mindy talked a lot about communities that have really been shattered by various forces over time. Is it hard to make the kind of programming and the kind of public spaces that you're discussing work in certain neighborhoods?
Well, that's
what do you do?
That's the flip side. So the way it works is the city builds the spaces, and then a local organization maintains and programs them. And that model works very well for large business improvement districts, and it works pretty well for small business improvement districts. But we're seeing nonprofits of all shapes and sizes, immigrant service groups, LDCs, all volunteer groups take this on because of this programming aspect and the ability to control what's happening, and because of the desire to have these amenities. But in neighborhoods where resources are scarce, it's tough. And so about half of the plazas being built are in those neighborhoods. And so the other sort of shift in New York that we're all talking about today is this desire to address equity. And in the parks, and I'm sure Steve is going to talk about this too, but in the parks and plaza arena, that means really trying to refine the public-private partnership to work in low-income communities. And that's what we're about. A lot of people are thinking about that. And I really feel like plazas, particularly because of the community control aspect, if they have the right mix of public and private support, they can be a model for an equitable and viable public-private partnership.
And do these, and Steve can also chime in, do you think these create a kind of community solidarity, or do the solidarity has to be there before they can really work? I mean, are they help in that aspect?
A little of both. What's interesting is it's a pretty heavy lift. These groups have to clean and maintain these plazas on a daily basis. They're willing to do that because of what they get out of it. So that it really is sort of the best of the public-private partnership on the ground. And that really does come from the bottom up, both in terms of the DOT's process, but also when groups step up, what you see happening neighborhood-wide as people rally around these spaces.
So do you want to dive in and add to Laura?
Yeah, the city, our elected officials have been pulling money out of the Parks Department since really going back to the financial crisis of the 70s. And I feel there's been a kind of conspiracy of silence about this over those years. And the result is a lot of public-private partnerships have formed to take up the slack and maintain our parks. There are more than 50 of these public-private partnerships now. Of course, the two best known are the Central Park Conservancy and the Prospect Park Alliance. And I think I've been involved with the Prospect Park Alliance for 20 years. And in the beginning, we were focused on big capital projects. But over the years, we had to take more and more responsibility for maintaining the park. And I think now most of the maintenance functions in Prospect Park are performed by the Prospect Park Alliance. And of course, in Central Park, the Conservancy runs Central Park. This has created a vast inequity because many parks in the city do not have these public-private partnerships. There have been different proposals for taxing Prospect Park and Central Park and spreading money around. I think that's a terrible idea. You know, when you're beholden to private sources for your funding, you have to consider the egos of your funders. And typically, they want to tell you where that money is going to go. But I do think there's an opportunity for creating public-private partnerships in other parts of the city. And it really would take leadership from our elected officials, who typically will spend their member items on Prospect Park or on Central Park because they know they can get some campaign support, funding support from the boards of those organizations. But I think that's a much better solution than the idea of taxing the two big parks.
Have you seen nonprofits that are maybe trying to spread that wealth? I guess I'm thinking of New York Restoration Project, but maybe they're not spreading widely enough.
Well, I was involved in starting the Open Space Alliance for North Brooklyn, which is dedicated to raising private money for all the parks in North Brooklyn, and Community Board 1 in North Brooklyn, which is Williamsburg and Greenpoint. It's a mission impossible, really. There are like 135 parks in that area, but we have had some successes. Councilperson Diana Reyna dedicated $2 million or $2.5 million toward improving Cooper Park. And I have to admit, most members of my board didn't even know Cooper Park existed, but it's actually the second biggest park in North Brooklyn. And I think if there were more organizations like the Open Space Alliance dedicated to a total area, then elected officials would see a broader possibility for spreading around their member items. And I think people who live by parks appreciate the proximity to the park, and hopefully you'd be able to get some money from them too. You know, if the city is not going to rebuild the Parks Department, this is the only way we're going to improve parks in New York City in the next generation. The Parks Department, you know, there's full employment at the Arsenal. There's full employment in all the boroughs at the parks headquarters. But on the ground, there are no parks workers. You know, a vast percentage of the people maintaining parks now are seconded from social service agencies, work release programs, and they're limited to 6-month tours of duty. And just managing those people is a monumental task. Getting productivity out of them is virtually, well, I won't say impossible, but it's very difficult. So I think there's no alternative but to try to take this model of public-private partnership. Instead of 50 of these organizations, we need 150 in the next 10 years.
Let me move to, we're going to go back to some of these. Let me move to Sherry, and you've kind of got a unique place that you work in, Times Square, which happens to be my neighborhood, so I'm thrilled with what you do. I'm also thrilled to have those street conversion into, you know, the kind of park space. So what does Times Square tell us about the rest of the city? But you, of course, have much broader experience in that you might want to speak to.
Sure. Yes, I am the Director of Public Art for Times Square right now, but I have worked in very rural, very suburban, and very urban environments. So I'm very sensitive to the smallest local community as well as the larger one. But I mean, Times Square obviously geographically is in the center of the city. It has the potential for being a cultural hub as well as being the hub for commerce that it has been. And really, because we have so many people coming through Times Square, we actually have a responsibility to experiment. We have the responsibility to be a little bit of a test bed and to try things out that other people might be a little bit nervous about. And contrary to public opinion, even though Times Square is quite profitable, our little program is not actually working off of any sort of huge patronage, and it's amazing, you know, what you can do on a Band-Aid. But it's important that we look at every platform. We're really interested in how we analyze public and how we analyze art. So it's giving access to places that very often private. We put work on the electronic billboards every single night. Those are all individually owned and operated. That is advertisers giving up their time. On the public plaza, we're dealing with all of the government agencies. You know, it's DOT for certain plazas. For Duffy Square, it's New York City Parks. There's that entire sort of government relationship. And then we're also creating a lot of programming in different venues, and that might be the AMC movie theater, which is the largest grossing movie theater in the United States, who has donated space and free ticket price for us to be able to experiment with downtown theaters, broadcasting into those spaces. So we're looking at every way that we might invite people in and to experience and also reimagine. I mean, Xavier, that was one of the things you were talking about, the power of reimagining and innovation. And I think one of the most important things to remember when we're talking about affordability is sustainability, and cultural sustainability is very important to that. And one of the biggest pitfalls is that we love innovation in a crisis. When everything is downtrodden or people aren't using spaces, that's when we invite the creative people in. And as soon as they start to be successful, we kind of shoo them away. And then people leave the centers. They leave city centers, and this happens all over the world. And then we bring the artists back in to revitalize. It's very important that we look at the investments that we make in innovation, and we look at how we can sustain them. Economically, it's much cheaper. Cultural fabric, it maintains a sense of reimagining the identity of who is coming and going. And it's really crucial that we think about how we serve all of the boroughs, but how we don't forget about the center of the city. People are not living in Brooklyn or Staten Island because they want to live anywhere or they want to live in a suburb. They're still drawn to being in New York and accessing the center of the city. So it's important for Times Square to still exist as a place of innovation so that we can draw and work with our partnerships throughout all of the boroughs and give them the access and the visibility and then send people back out again. We are an enormous transport hub. The diversity of individuals who come through Times Square is phenomenal, and it's not intimidating. It's not a sort of cultural sector that people from different segments of society are going to feel awkward. Anybody can feel welcome there. So it's important that we take advantage of that kind of diversity and we open up the assets that we have there, but we also work very strongly with all of our cultural partners throughout the city so that we're giving them the kind of vitality and the visibility and the access that they can have.
I think public space or the public realm often is an abstraction, especially to maybe a lot of private sector people and politicians, and we talk about placemaking, and these things are all abstractions. How do we make it real so that we can really sort out and prioritize? Because you're clearly correct about the parks. Other speakers are clearly correct about the role of libraries. We're clearly in deep need of additional transportation resources, and we're clearly in deep need of affordable housing. How do we prioritize? How do we keep things in view that we need to keep?
You know, before I go on, I do not want to denigrate the people in the Parks Department. There are great people working in the Parks Department. But they cannot get up on the soapbox like me and tell what's really going on. I think one of the great things about the Open Space Alliance for North Brooklyn is that we've been able to tap into the existing community in North Brooklyn, which is a very much an activist community. And also the new people moving into North Brooklyn. You know, with the development on the waterfront in North Brooklyn, there are 40,000 new residents there. And so we have both kinds of people on the board. And because of our commitment to parks all over North Brooklyn, we've been able to do little tours around Bushwick and you know, South Williamsburg, and show them the state of the parks in those areas. And you kind of get buy-in from them in a way that, you know, you show them things they've never seen before. And because of that, we've been able to get some local businesses to adopt some parks that were just completely ignored for years and years and years. There was one over in Bushwick, which was informally known as the Ugly Park. And if you saw that park, you would understand the name, because basically it was all asphalt and sort of the you know, shadows of a playground, but there wasn't much there. And some local businesses have adopted that park and made some efforts to put some greenery there and improve it and clean it up. So I think just getting people involved in these public-private partnerships has value in itself.
Others, you want to dive in?
I would also add to that and to say that what I'm seeing on the ground with the Plaza program and the way that it's structured, it's inviting groups in who are not typically part of this process, and they are both learning how to navigate government, they're improving on their work with government. And so building on what the panel earlier was talking about being more holistic and thinking about neighborhood development, these public-private partnerships, for all their flaws, and there are many, they do create a sense of local ownership that can then begin to play out in other conversations around housing and other planning issues, because those are the people who've been there for a long time, typically, who are really committed to their neighborhood and who are willing to invest sweat equity in making change.
I think it's important that we look from top down and bottom up simultaneously. So it's really important if there's going to be a commitment to arts and culture, that actually is reflected in policy. Putting it in policy doesn't mean that you necessarily are contributing dollars, but it says that it's important and it sets objectives that you want your private partners to fulfill. So in other words, when a developer is sitting at the table and they're trying to understand the priorities and the objectives and the visions, if it's embedded in the policy, it's easier to convince them that what you're trying to realize is something they need to make a commitment to. And then from the bottom up, there are so many opportunities. Artists and creative people are not a breed or a species absent from all other individuals. They are all part of your communities. So their presence in any kind of community activity is important. You know, perhaps it's always making sure that there is a representative from the creative sector that's on a community board. It's understanding that there's always a creative person who's part of any kind of charrette that happens. It's perhaps looking at the flexibility of % for art and how they might be able to spend some of that for programmatic use. As well. So there are very many easy ways that you can involve these individuals, their creative thought, and also potentially their opportunity and their resources at every level. But you need to support it in the vision as well as in the daily practicalities.
Polly, just back to you. Do you feel that, you know, back to the kind of affordability and access, I think, aspect, would you just like the MTA to maximize its investments in the least transit-served neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods that get lower income people to jobs?
I mean, of course, in a perfect world, the MTA would have the resources it needed to do that. And I think, as a lot of us know, the MTA has, you know, they've been pretty strapped financially for a lot of years. You know, typically they're about to do their next 5-year capital plan, and I think they have enough funding lined up to pay for 2 years of it. So, you know, realistically speaking, that's why partnering with them on things like select bus service, which which can be reasonably affordable, has been a good way to build out the transit network at a lower cost than, you know, putting in new subway lines. And you know, New York City DOT has tried to do a lot of other things to build out the transportation network, adding bike lanes, which can be a very inexpensive way for people to get around the city. And probably a lot of people have seen, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of City Bike. And there's been a lot of interesting coverage about the discussion of City Bike, and speaking of equity and access questions, and is it a public amenity, and how do we make sure that neighborhoods that don't get it can get it, and that it will really help people connect to mass transit and connect to job opportunities. And I think that's something in the long run we'd really like to see happen more in New York.
The last administration put a lot of focus on the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, because they saw those huge tracts of land as real opportunities to build a lot of units of housing, including affordable housing. And that included a major public space component. Everybody had to build an esplanade, and some of them had to do more complicated things like Domino and the old warehouse. Is that a good model? Is that a model that needs to be improved? Seems to get all the parts and pieces.
I think it was important for North Brooklyn. It had to happen. I supported it. You know, the problem is, under the Bloomberg administration, many hundreds of acres of parks were added to the city. But the park's budget, the maintenance budget, did not increase proportionately. It actually went down for more years than it went up under Bloomberg. But actually under Bloomberg was the first time it had gone up for many decades. Some of those are funded by the developers and the residents of the new buildings, and that's a good thing. I think that's working out fairly well. But you know, the bigger gulf between the need for maintenance of parks and the reality is very great. Also, you know, I applaud the focus on affordable housing. Of course, who could be against affordable housing? But you know, affordable housing is not cheap. And there's also got to be a focus on jobs and development of business in the city. And I fear that we may be turning away from some concepts like the industrial business zones, which were not perfect because you know, there were a lot of commercial uses that were allowed in those zones that you know, manufacturers and business cannot really compete with. But there's got to be a balance here between developing housing and developing jobs because you can't afford the housing if you don't have a decent job. You know, New York is, America is a very strange place these days. I sell a lot of beer in Sweden, and so I've been spending a lot of time in Sweden. The Swedes pay taxes that Americans can't imagine. I mean, it's like 60% of your income and more. They have very high wages. Everyone has very liberal work rules and, you know, paternity leaves, and it's like an alternate universe. And their parks are beautiful, and they're frequently cited as the happiest people on earth. I wish everyone here could spend a little time in Sweden, and it might give you a whole different way of looking at the world, or maybe not this room, maybe all Americans.
I was just in Portland, Oregon, where there does seem to be a brewery on every corner, and they seem pretty happy. So,
so the breweries are overtaking the coffee houses as the symbol of success for urban places.
Breweries are good community builders, I believe.
Let's not get too far off here. But I do like the Brooklyn example because also the conundrum of that huge development is that it was not near transportation. And so, okay, someone says, let's put a trolley line or a select bus line along the waterfront. But it struck me that that really lacked any kind of larger strategic vision about the role that transportation plays. And MTA, you know, aspires to be strategic, but doesn't seem to ever succeed. And also, you have a federal perspective too. What are you going to advocate to your, you know, the people in the federal side that's really going to help us out?
Yeah, well, there's a couple questions there. I mean, first of all, yes, by the time you've already built the housing development, it's too late to then turn around and go, oh, wait a minute, now we need a select bus route. I mean, that has to be an integral part of the planning from the start. Much easier said than done, I recognize that. And obviously, our administration has very ambitious goals in terms of housing. And we also want to make things happen quickly. So a lot of pieces have to come together. But good transportation planning, obviously, is very integral to what you're going to do on the housing front. And I agree with Steve, to connect to economic opportunities. I mean, that is another fundamental piece here. If we can't connect folks to jobs and opportunities, right, they won't be able to afford the housing no matter what we're pricing it at. At the federal level, you know, sadly, there's been a lot of paralysis on the transportation front writ large in Washington, really because we're tied up in knots over funding. There's been a real challenge at the federal level. Congress is happy to authorize spending on highways and transit at much greater volumes than we're actually taking in terms of the federal gas tax. And that is really, I think, in a lot of ways, stymied a bigger policy discussion.
Before I get to a couple questions, there was also a discussion of, you know, public engagement and how publics are involved. And it does strike me that New York is a little primitive in over-relying on public hearings. Are we leaving things on the table that involve people or connect leadership to citizens, connect, you know, interest groups that have the public in mind with, you know, the political side of things?
You know, I think one of the important things that we've been able to do in North Brooklyn is help the Parks Department explain itself and plan projects in North Brooklyn. You know, the Bloomberg administration gave Parks $50 million to redo the McCarran Park pool. There had been a battle over the McCarran Park pool going back 30 years. There were probably 7 different organizations claiming to represent the, you know, the Friends of McCarran Park pool, the real Friends of McCarran Park pool, etc. And we did a charrette to involve the community in developing the plan for that project. And it was quite amazing. We took all the lightning rods and kind of spread them around the room in different, at different tables. And actually we came out with a very good plan that everyone bought into. I think that kind of role is important for these public-private partnerships.
And Commissioner, you can speak to this better than I can, but as an outsider, the Plaza program at the DOT has a process that is bottom-up, where community groups apply to have a plaza, work with the agency to pick the best site and to create, and then a long series of public meetings built into the process for around design issues. It's a really good process. And then on the operation side, groups like mine and others out there who really serve to provide resources to these groups can help them begin to develop lots of strategic partnerships locally, citywide, to start to do that leadership development that increases public engagement at a lot of different levels.
I would just say also, I mean, communities are experts on use. So the earlier in the process, the better. They can really talk about how they've used the place, what are the obstacles that they've had. They can help you do that audit of the cultural resources and the community resources that are there. So waiting until a public hearing seems really late for people to throw that expertise in. But if there are all these initial sort of consultations that are happening now as a result of the affordability for public housing, then this is the time to start engaging the community most. I mean, they'll tell you what's working, what's not working, what they'd like to see, and then from that they can engage in conversations of experts of design and experts of management and experts of programming then to help them really realize a shared vision.
Good. Let me try out this question. I think it's primarily for Polly and Sherry. Is NYC DOT committed to expanding public plazas and art? Do you have explicit goals like you do for express bus service?
Good question. Yes, we are committed, and you know, as Laura's mentioned, we have our next round of the Plaza program just going out, and I have to say, I think one of the challenges that Laura is really going to be spending her time on, that's a little bit of it is definitely a conundrum, which is we want to, I think the Blasio administration, we really want to make sure that we're spreading the Plaza program, and public art as well, but really focus on the Plaza program for a minute, throughout all the city, and really getting into the corners of the cities, for example, you don't have a big bid like you're going to have in Times Square, and tackling the ongoing challenge of maintenance and management of those spaces, I think it's a profound challenge, the same one you face with the parks, which is some of the more iconic parts of the city that's easy to do, and frankly, corporate support and private donors are very, you know, ready, willing, and able to jump in, but there are parts of the city where that's not so true, and I think for us, really cracking that nut, and I'm hoping Laura's going to do it, is going to be very, very fundamental. On select bus service, actually, in the mayor's platform when he ran for mayor, he committed to getting to 20 select bus service lines by the end of his first term. We just announced, counting some of the ones that are already existing, admittedly, so we just announced number 7 yesterday, as I mentioned, which is Harlem, Astoria, and LaGuardia Airport. So we have 13 to go, and I'm happy to say in the mayor's budget that was released a couple weeks ago, he put $90 million in there, which is really going to help us. MTA has to be our partner, so they too have to come up with their share of the funds, and they have to operate and maintain the system ongoing. So working with them is a key part of this, but they have been terrific partners and have expressed a real interest in, you know, seeing if we can get to that 20. We have started, speaking of the public engagement process, we do very extensive public engagement on Select Bus. We started already with some public meetings for Woodhaven Boulevard in Queens, And in about a week and a half, we're going to be looking at Flushing, Jamaica. So that process is well underway, and I'm really hoping we'll get there by the end of our first term.
Good. Let me try another question. Are you going to expand the pedestrian wayfinding citywide?
Yes, that has been super popular. And actually, I have to take a minute to do a shout out if she's here. Wendy I have two people from DOT here. Well, I think one of them left. Wendy Foyer, who is our Assistant Commissioner for Design, Art, and Wayfinding. I don't know, Wendy, are you here? Yes, all right, hello. There's Wendy, who's in charge of the program. Give her a hand. Yes, and I will say it was interesting. You know, yesterday it was fascinating to watch when we did the launch of Select Bus Service. We had a wonderful kiosk which has both wayfinding and real-time bus information. And it was funny, I was there with a group of city elected officials. They were entranced. They loved it, and they said, how much does this cost? Well, with the real-time bus information, it costs $30,000. If you're just doing wayfinding, you can do the installation. And they were immediately saying, well, maybe we could invest some of our, our council funds in these. I mean, they love them. I think we would love to do more of it around the city. Funding is the challenge, obviously, because we have a lot of competing priorities. But yes, we're going to do more, and I think hopefully we're actually going to partner with some of the elected officials around the city who can help us figure out good places to put it in their districts and perhaps partner with us on the funding as well.
I think I can squeeze one more question in. Any myths any of you want to explode about public space, crime-ridden, attract the wrong people, whatever?
Well, there were a couple of things I was told when I came into this position 2 years ago. One, New Yorkers will never come to Times Square. This is a myth. If you bring what New Yorkers love and you bring it somewhere, then they will come. And then the other thing that was really interesting, the first thing I did was really explode the term of tourist, which is often left with this sort of nasty aftertaste or derogatory sensibility. And you realize that tourists are people who actually leave their homes, they're not watching TV, they've actually spent money to come out, and they're curious about the world. And we realize that actually this is kind of the ideal audience to be able to show off and to be able to work with contemporary art. So tourists are people probably like you, like me, who go other places, and so their minds are quite open.
I think if elected officials in the far reaches of New York would embrace the idea of a public-private partnership for their parks, I think they would find a willing community to help them. You know, the parks all over the city get used. No matter what kind of condition they're in, they get used. And people just need a little help understanding how they can improve things. So I think the public-private partnership model could work all over the city, but I think our electeds have to embrace it and lead it.
I'm just going to reiterate what Steve said, because when I talk to groups and parks groups in a former life about this issue, and lots of little groups would say, we're going to be like the High Line. And, you know, you have to sort of smile and say, you're probably not going to be like the High Line. And so the myth that that is the answer in every neighborhood, and just what Steve was saying, it's not, but that's not to say that it's not going to evolve, and we are in a great moment, a big public conversation about equity, and people thinking really hard about how to change that equation. So I'm really hopeful that we can change it in the next few years.
Well, I think it's time to thank this terrific panel.